I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast. I'm Aaron Bergstrom, and I'm here with my brothers,
Anders
And Anton.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And this month we're talking about the newest Godzilla movie, Takashi Yamazaki's Godzilla Minus One. Before we offer a few thoughts on Zack Snyder's new space opera for Netflix, Rebel Moon, A Child of Fire, Part 1.
And here we go.
In Ishiro Honda's 1954 classic Godzilla, the giant reptile monster was an avatar of nuclear war, an embodiment of Japan's national fear that had yet to dissipate like the nuclear clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. He was a big lizard that crunched buildings and used his atomic breath to torch mountainsides, but he was also a symbol as much as a physical threat. Takashi Yamazaki's Godzilla Minus One, the latest film in the long-running kaiju franchise from Toho Studios, takes a cue from Honda's original film and returns the lizard to his symbolic origins. In Yamazaki's film, Godzilla is a living, breathing reminder of the cost of war and the regrets over past failures for the Japanese nation at large, but especially for the young war veteran Koichi Shikishima, played by Ryunosuke Kamiki. In the film's opening, Koichi abandons his mission as a kamikaze pilot only to run into Godzilla in the aftermath. Koichi survives Godzilla, just as he survives the war, but is tortured by the notion that he's a coward. All his subsequent actions in Godzilla Minus One are an attempt to rectify that fact, to make up for pulling away from his kamikaze mission in the dying days of World War II, when he knew that his sacrifice would be meaningless for a losing Japan. Koichi tries to get over his regret by building a life with Noriko and Akiko, fellow orphans he meets in the ruins of Tokyo, as well as by working as a naval minesweeper. But Koichi's conscience, and that pesky lizard Godzilla, just won't let well enough alone. The past won't rest in Godzilla Minus One, which animates every moment in the film. The clarity of vision in both Godzilla's role and Koichi's domestic life gives the film its clear character motivations and sympathetic portraits. We care about these people and hope for the best for them, which is essential because Godzilla is going to destroy their world. This investment in character pays off in the film's action scenes, which are clear and exciting, with escalating stakes and coherent cause and effect that builds suspense at every juncture. Yamazaki's film succeeds because it treats every detail, from the characters to the action, with the same attention to detail, and it favors clarity at every juncture of its storytelling. It clearly lays out the emotional turmoil that Koichi suffers and takes time to depict the motivations for his subsequent actions, both in order to atone for his past and to protect the present he's made with Noriko. It also clearly lays out the plan to combat Godzilla with a naval plot to trap the monster and submerge him rapidly into the depths of the ocean.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
あれはゴジラ?
I was surprised by how engaging Godzilla Minus One is, both emotionally and viscerally, but I'm curious whether you guys think the same. Were you as impressed as I was? Anton, what did you think of Godzilla Minus One?
I thought it was good. I thought it was a very competent blockbuster. I'm not someone who's deeply invested in kaiju fandom, and so I don't come at it with a lot of sort of built up expectations or anything. I more saw it on a whim, but I did enjoy it, and I think you point out a lot of how it's an all around well made movie, well acted. The storyline and the characters are invested with more seriousness and sort of nuance and attention than I would expect from the sort of American equivalent of this kind of a movie. So I had a good time watching it.
What about you, Anders?
I liked it quite a bit. I thought it was, as Anton said, a really good blockbuster, which is all even more impressive given the budget isn't quite as big as most American films of similar quality. I think it looked really great. The special effects were good, the production values. But what I was most surprised by was that I was engaged by the human story. This sort of post-war tale of Koichi trying to come to grips with his experiences during the war. I thought the film, there's some scenes that to me were quite moving. Like it is that sort of what I liked is how it combines the kaiju film, the monster film, with the kind of like period. It's not a period. It would have been contemporary melodramas, like almost like some of the scenes could have been like almost like out of like a little scene from Ozu or something like that, right? In that
Mm-hmm.
post-war
Mm-hmm.
era. And especially characters coming to grips with their emotion, their feelings, but in a really like that classically Japanese way, right? So I really liked all that stuff, and to me, it actually came together quite well, right? Like in the end, like, but it's also an interesting film because it is so thematically, it deals with the themes around like Japan's feelings of shame and guilt around the end of World War II and all that transposed onto the character of Koichi, right? But I think it ends up, suggesting that sometimes those martial values of sacrifice and like, in the name of nation and stuff like that are less important than the connections to people and that injunction to live, right? Like to me was like really really interesting. So I think it is actually not just a enjoyable monster movie, which it is. There's some great shots. We can talk about like some of the Godzilla action. Like I don't know, I just love scenes of like when this movie gives Godzilla some of his scale, even though he's not as big as in some of the other recent ones like Shin Godzilla. Like you get a sense of scale, like a shot of Godzilla swimming under a battleship under the water. Love that kind of stuff, right? It just it gives him this that
It's everything is always showing Godzilla in relation to something else on screen because he's a
yeah
constant threat, right? He's coming.
yeah
So you see the destroyer out there, and you're like this movie's really good in like not to jump too far into it, but the movie's very competent and competent in a way like I don't want to say that I'm underselling it by saying competent, but it's just like it knows to hit all the marks in an action scene about how to
yep
invest us and then to make like the scene swell within a moment, right? Because people I think nowadays treat action scenes as it's more of like something to like impress you, but it's a static experience, right? It doesn't like go up and down. And this movie understands that there's like a build, a natural sequential filmmaking within an action scene where you like set the stakes and then you build the stakes throughout the scene, right? And so you get stuff, you get these scenes of like, the first they're out in the minesweeper and Godzilla shows up and they're like, holy crap, guys, like we're cooked. And they're trying to shoot him. They're like trying to do anything to stop him. And
he's chasing the boat there. Yeah,
that's where they get the little scene of like put the mine in him and he shoots the mine in his mouth and it blows a hole in him. And it's like that seems to hurt him, but he regenerates. It doesn't matter. But then the destroyer shows up at the last minute and like blasts Godzilla out of the sky. And you're like, oh man, like that's so sweet. But the scene doesn't end there, right? It like Godzilla comes back up and just demolishes the destroyer. But the way that like the pace and like it, it's not like super surprising, but it's very satisfying to see the way that it like hits these junctures where you're like, we think we're saved. Oh no, all is lost. And it comes back and then like hits you in the end. It's really entertaining.
so it's not just competence in terms of technical filmmaking skill. It's competence in understanding how to use the conventions of the sort of contemporary blockbuster, but having a sense of pacing and variation in order to actually introduce narrative and emotional experience and variance into the film, which is frankly something that a lot of films nowadays don't do. They think
Well, so it's competent like storytelling, both in terms storytelling within the action sequences as well as within what are often sort of seen as sort of the extraneous extra material around action scenes. And in that sense, it does remind me of Spielberg, because within each action sequence, it tells a story. It's not just a series of like action beats or sort of like things happening. There's actually sort of, I think you described well, sort of the flow and movement within those action sequences, and the way it also without giving away the ending, like it's the kind of thing in the final action scene. There is a climactic moment which is satisfying even though you kind of anticipate it. And I think that's a nice quality when you can sort of like the arc is sort of completed and you sort of kind of are hoping or expecting that to happen, and then it does happen. It's satisfying rather than a letdown of being like, oh well, that's just sort of flat. To me, like
exactly.
it does that well.
It understands genre conventions, understands filmmaking, the way you set up expectations, and that there can be a satisfaction in experiencing what you expect, not just in subversion and things like that, right? It's interesting you note like the sort of Spielbergian aspect because in preparation for this, I was looking at Yamazaki's filmography and his like Wikipedia bio because I didn't know much about him, to be honest. I haven't seen any of his other films, and he does mention specifically that Steven Spielberg and Star Wars were the two things that inspired him to become a filmmaker. So it sounds like he's learned some lessons. So
Yeah, and he's talked about Jaws as a big influence on
The
this
scene
film
on the
because
boat you talked about is
totally.
so Jaws, and the way and also the character interactions on the boat.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's the idea
Yeah.
that like if you invest in the characters and makes the action scenes more exciting, and if the action scenes are you invest actual stakes in them, the characters are more credible because you care about them then and you're like worrying about whether they're going to die or not, right? And so it's like both sides of the film feed each other, and then I think that's kind of the characteristic of Godzilla minus one that really like that is the central success of the film is that the two sides of the movie work. It's not one of these action films where the action's good and the characters are kind of bland and boring, or where you're like, well, that was some nice dramatic scenes, but I wish the action scenes were exciting. It actually hits both elements, and I couldn't really see this movie working if it wasn't in unison, because Godzilla does work as that real physical threat in the moment for these characters, but also like he embodies all the symbolic things as well, right? Like he is the specter of war who's returned. He is the nuclear holocaust that lies like as a threat over Japan. He is the idea of like the monster who will forever cow Koichi for his cowardice, right? Like he's all those things. And so the characters have like a personal investment to combat him, but also a societal investment. And I think there's a great scene in this movie, Anders, when like you mentioned how the film really is tapping into the idea of Japan's like shame over the war.
Yeah.
Because Koichi has shame over being a kamikaze pilot and failing that, but also everybody in this movie is also suffering from this idea that Japan lost the war. They lost it. They're like humbled by their American conquerors. They constantly are talking about MacArthur and like the Americans don't want us to do this. The Americans don't want us to do that. We're completely at their mercy at this point. But there's also a kind of almost like implicit acknowledgement from the characters that they were also losing, or like they were fighting on the side of a lost cause, like a cause that wasn't worthy of anything, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you get the scene where it's all the naval men who decide that they're gonna, we used to be soldiers and we were fighting a war that wasn't worth fighting for, but this is maybe a cause that we can finally do something. And they all kind of rally together. And it's funny because it's these characters that you only get little snippets of, but the camaraderie that's actually built there is very meaningful, especially during the final action scene, which is this big naval strategy to like trap Godzilla. And the characters are like so invested in it that you get these little ebbs and flows of characters that we only know a little bit, but you're actually invested in their like bonds with each other. And they're like, I don't know, it's just this movie does a good job of even having like the admiral character where you're like, this is like a very like respectable like man. Like it's just like it's interesting how the film does something almost similar to say like Top Gun Maverick or something, where it makes you like reinvest in kind of these so-called corny aspects of like heroism in a film, where you're like, oh yeah, like that's a guy I can cheer for.
Yeah, and that's given like Japanese audiences somebody that they can cheer for, interestingly, in a period context without valorizing the imperial military endeavor. So it is a kind of recuperation in a weird way.
Well, remember, it's also a civilian. Like they choose as free men to do this. They're like, it's very clear. It's not a military exercise. It's not a government exercise. It's men who have this experience who are going to join forces to do what is right and to, implicitly right the wrongs that they were doing in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a movie that it goes one step further than just the shame of defeat, and it begins to sort of criticize the whole imperial Japanese project, because I think it goes out of its way at multiple points in the movie to say, the government lies to us, the government is not trustworthy, but then it wants to build up the sort of the nobility and potential and heroism of the Japanese people, while distancing the Japanese people from sort of the imperial
Right.
Japanese government,
Because
so that it
because
can have this in a sort of a post-war environment without sort of doing, I think, something that sometimes is being sort of criticized, where it's just like you focus on sort of the Japanese victimhood of
yeah,
being the victims of the atomic bomb, but
absolutely.
not also the perpetrator. So I thought it was actually a Japanese movie that's starting to grapple on multiple
Yeah.
levels with this
It's
stuff.
a there's a rarity in that. I think that some of that, I mean, we could get into some of the, like, why that also might resonate today, right? In an era when people have distrust of, like, institutions and things like that,
Yes,
which is
yeah,
something in
yeah,
Japan that is a serious issue, right? Given recent politics, the distrust of government, that culminated in, like, the assassination of Abe last year and things like that, right? So, and even the way the government there handled COVID, things like that, there is a lot of, like, underlying Japanese anger at the government and things like that. Um, yeah, but I think contextualizing it in 1947, because, like, that, I guess that's, like, we could maybe shift here for a minute and think of it like that title, like Godzilla minus one, right?
yeah. The title is
It's like
intriguing.
going
I've been trying to sort of pick through it and be like,
because
okay,
it's
what
like
does this mean?
the original Godzilla is 1954, right? But this is like kind of retelling, but, like, what if we went back one step further? Because the history of Japan after the war is that, like, until the 50s, they did not even have their own government, right? They were
Yeah,
occupied
occupied.
by
Yeah.
the Americans.
MacArthur
MacArthur
was
was
essentially,
the
yeah.
essentially the ruler of Japan. Um, and so at this point in which the movie is set, you can actually deal with some of those things because Japan is only a bunch of free people and like an occupying force, and
Yeah.
the government is like sort of a puppet government in a sense, right?
And that explains why when they say things like, well, the Americans don't want to do this because they don't want to antagonize the
The
Russians,
Soviets, yeah.
and I feel, or so, yeah, like the Soviets, and some people will in the audience might just be like, well, why are the Americans sort of determining this? Because they're actually,
They control
you
the
know,
whole
yeah, there's a
region.
military occupation that's actually in 47 running the country. But then also, I think this also this being so close to the war, right? 47, not 54, also means that, yeah, I think Aaron, you did a good job of starting to tease out like what is the meaning and the symbolism of Godzilla within this movie, and it's not just the atomic bomb in that stuff. It's like it's the larger war.
Well, think about like the scene where Koichi goes back to Tokyo and he
Yeah.
he
Oh, man.
talks to his neighbor, and like it's like where were my parents? And it's like, oh, that's where the house used to be. And it has the matter of fact talking about the firebombing that just
Yeah.
destroyed the entirety of Tokyo. And it's one of those historical episodes that Japan doesn't forget at all, but in our like Western history, we gloss over it. Like the fact that through conventional bombing, we burnt Tokyo to the ground and we killed 100,000 people. Like
Yeah.
it's one of those like war atrocities that it's like Dresden. We just kind of don't really talk about.
Yeah, and it gets overshadowed
And
or forgotten
yeah.
in light of or in the shadow of the atomic bomb.
Right, and possibly because of the architecture of Japan, it was more even total destruction
Yeah,
because of,
wooden
like, wooden
homes,
houses
so
and things like
basically.
that. Like, that scene when he's walking through the rubble, like, I think some viewers who might not, if you missed the cue that this is Tokyo, people would assume that this is the rubble of the nuclear attack, right? Like, every building is flattened. What's amazing is that within 15 years, Tokyo is basically rebuilt, right? Even by the time of the first Godzilla film, uh, in '54, right? So this is a rare period where you don't actually see a lot of movies set in that, like, immediate aftermath and rubble and the absolute destruction, there, and I think that is very interesting to me, right?
Yeah, and
And it really resonates.
it's something that leans into like the the post-war period in Japan in film. Um, they weren't really dealing with that the destruction and the rubble within like conventional dramas. They were dealing with it in a genre, right? It was the Nikatsu noir stuff. It was those like you even get it in Akira Kurosawa films like Stray Dog and stuff. This idea that the post-war Japan, specifically Tokyo, was this black market network because it was under American occupation. It didn't work as a as a functioning society. So everything was like what you could hard scrabble together. What could you like sell or barter or like make some deals and get the food, build your place up. And so the fact that the city like rebuilds itself is kind of this remarkable fact because it's just it was so devastating.
Yeah. One of my favorite films that is set in that era, in the American occupation era, is Imamura's Pigs and Battleships. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't watched it yet. I need to.
It's kind of a bit of a Yakuza noir, but the main character is kind of like a hapless like kid who wants to be in the gang. But it's called Pigs and Battleships because essentially they're like stealing pork and selling it back to the Americans and stuff like that. But it is all about like exactly what you're saying, like the sort of lawlessness of that era. One of the only other films also that I've seen is the first film of the Yakuza Papers trilogy, Battles Without Honor or Humanity. Has an opening scene set in the rubble of the post-war, and it's basically suggesting that like also the Yakuza mafia rose up in that lawless period because there could be no official government. They could basically insinuate themselves into every aspect of society at that time.
Yeah, so like the part of the reason why I bring this up is just because if you have even if you just have like a cursory understanding of Japanese history purely through film, there's a context that you understand in those scenes in Tokyo that Koichi and Noriko, like as they're building their domestic situation, is like reacting against, right? And the other movie that it reminded me of, honestly, was Grave of the Fireflies, because it is Yamazaki has commented about how Ghibli is like very influential to him, just in terms of storytelling.
I can tell, even all the airplane stuff and all that.
Exactly.
Island has a bit of Porco Rosso to it and stuff.
Yeah. And Grave of the Fireflies is this like unflinching depiction of Tokyo at that time period, and specifically like Akiko is totally like a Grave of the Fireflies type character. This orphan in the war, and just the way that the matter of fact explanations are like. Once Noriko says it's like, oh, and Akio's mom was like on her, as dying, was like, take care of my child. There's no real questioning of like whether she should have said yes or not. It's just like, of course I owe this to this person who like in their like last earthly wish asks me to take care of their child. So it invests so much in these characters. And actually, I think that sequence after he comes back to Tokyo, you have the initial conflict with his neighbor Somiko, played by Sakura Ando, who's, I think, a very interesting character. She doesn't get a ton in this, but there's like a lot of texture and like a really good performance there about what her care for Aki, because so she basically, his neighbor has lost her children in the firebombing, and she's acting out her anger about the Americans devastating Tokyo on Koichi, who it's like, if only you had done your mission, we wouldn't have lost this war. If only I would have still had my kids, which it's completely beside the point. Of course, him killing himself, attacking a destroyer would have done nothing to save her children. But it's a very like believable wartime, her placing her like anger from one to another, like convenient target and stuff. But the way that the relationship builds over time, because it never develops into anything that's actually like openly friendly. It's just, we understand that she, again, places all of her like the love and care and attention that she used to have for her children onto Akiko. And it's just this like idea of like, if Japan is to survive, this child has to thrive. And so everything that matters is just about this child doing better. And the movie takes like a good patient 30 minutes to build this domestic scenario in a rebuilding Tokyo, which I think it's actually really clever how the movie flashes forward a little bit of time and you see the modest regrowth of the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
It's not like it rapidly develops. There's still a lot of garbage and like junk and like rooms.
People are starting to build houses and gardens and things living like that.
And it builds this thing, which is what makes it so devastating once Godzilla shows up in the city. And it is this kind of like, I thought we were over, it really does set up like, I thought we were over war. I thought we were over nukes. And then when he like finally unleashes the atomic breath in Tokyo, it's just, the movie literally like takes a moment to sit back and just watch this devastation and this atom bomb. Like the camera tilts up to watch the cloud go up and all the people
Yeah.
being like, my lord, like I thought this was like a bad dream, but it's here now. It's just a nice sequence. I also like that sequence not only because it like involves Noriko on the train and that the way that the set piece works is like very suspenseful, but it's also it's a clever means of the film using its limited resources for its advantage. It almost seems like it's using miniatures and stuff at moments, or like the way that the trains are acting, and like Anders mentioned early that this movie's very low budget. Like if you don't know, this movie's cost $15 million. Like
It's stunning because it looks as good as like most like contemporary like Marvel or DC.
It's like an
movies.
indie film budget for North America.
Wow.
But I do like that's a good scene, I think, for its emotional resonance, and it pays off the amount of investment that we've had in the characters. But I do think the naval plotting and stuff, like it's just very enjoyable watching them bring up a plan. We're going to talk through the plan. Let's execute the plan. The plan goes wrong, and then we have to pivot. It's just like it's the whole Ocean's 11 thing I always think of with Soderbergh, where it's like I'm going to talk you through the thing, and because I'm telling you what happens and I'm showing you what happens, that it won't actually play out that way. And there's a knowingness in the way it's presented, so it actually creates suspense of being like, well, what's it actually going to play out like? And then you actually see the real.
Again, it's playing with expectation and the development of scenes through those genre conventions. One last thing, I just thinking about like the formation of this sort of like new family that even Koichi has to basically decide that he actually wants this and deserves this in a sense, right? And a lot of films nowadays deal with these sort of what we might call the chosen family, or the makeshift family that is formed out of people who don't have any blood ties. But I think this film, even and the scenes when he has like his colleagues over for dinner and stuff like that, and they're like, "What? This isn't your son?
Yeah, this isn't your wife. This isn't your child. You're living with them. What's wrong with you?" Like, because remember, it's Japanese society. It's very very strict cultural expectations.
But what it also then does is shows that the value, if we're really going to call friends and chosen family, then it has to transcend the sort of the free choice in a sense, and there has to be an aspect of duty, and that it recuperates then that aspect of Japanese filial piety and duty into this new context, so there's I don't know, there's something beautiful to me about like we always want to like throw away the old, or we want to close off anything new. Often those are the sort of dichotomies in culture that we kind of have. This says there's value in these virtues or ways of living. At the same time, they're best served by opening ourselves to others and but still having a sense of duty and stuff. So to me, actually, frankly, it's like it's a very I don't know if it sounds horrible or not horrible. It sounds belittling to say it's a very moral movie. I think in a lot of ways it's dealing with a lot of those kinds of issues on many levels, both from the large scale of war down to the individual and the relationship with like others.
So that's interesting because then his personal story then parallels sort of the national story.
Yes.
Because Koichi has to choose not just to do his duty, but then it also has to be an active like choice to pursue like new aspects of life too. Like it's like you've gone through the war, and it's like his rejection of doing the kamikaze is sort of saying like, me fulfilling my duty, if it doesn't actually make any sense or have any purpose, like it's not a good like duty. or that's not actually fulfilling the responsibilities when it's like devoid of any purpose or meaning. But the movie's not, it's not like a rejection of duty, right? It's more of like, how do you repurpose that? Because then, as you sort of said in the family dynamic, I think you're right that the movie, it's not saying that he shouldn't feel this towards them through living, with them and what he owes them and all that sort of stuff. But then he also requires sort of choosing to embrace sort of the next stages, and that on the national level is kind of like the predicament of the nation then, where it's like,
Yeah.
you can't now, like, you're at a point where you can't just do your duty anymore. In fact, doing your duty to sort of this corrupt government, which the film goes out of its way to point out, isn't with purpose. But what's the, like, how are you going to choose what the next step is? And what it tries to set forward as being sort of the purpose is kind of a newfound like community between the different Japanese people, right? Like, and it's in that scene where, like, people are choosing to embrace the heroism and the sacrifice of, like, we're going to go do this mission and probably a bunch of us won't come back. So it's the film, I think, is thematically trying to combine, it's not a rejection of duty, but it's trying to combine duty with choice, with choosing the next stage and that sort of thing.
Just on the topic of like the guys doing the right duty, this is not nearly as thematic an examination here, but I just want to pivot and talk about how much this movie loves Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk and wants to be it. The scene where the young crewman shows, so basically there's Koichi joins a ship, the Minesweeper, and he becomes friends with the captain. And there's the old scientist who used to be a war engineer, and there's this young crewman who really wants to prove himself, and Shiro, and he's just like, oh, I'm going to do this and that. And he's like got a broken arm, and they're like, no, we don't want you to like sacrifice. You have a life to live. That's you're going to be your duty. And then at like darkest moment, he shows up with like this whole fleet of merchant vessels, like private vessels again, like people just coming out to help, and they're going to help. All the tugs are going to come, like tug the destroyers to get Godzilla under the water, or like pull it up. And it's funny because it's one of those moments where it's so obvious what it's trying to do. It's trying to do the moment in Dunkirk where all the like fishermen's come over,
the little,
and
what do they call it?
the little boats,
fleet,
the dinghies and
boats.
stuff, right? The little boat, the fleet where home shows up, so-called, right, in Dunkirk. And if you notice in the music of this movie too is also very Dunkirk, because it's like atonal, like very somber tones that were just hit between the two, like those two like notes is just like an undercurrent. And then when Godzilla shows up, you get the timpani coming in, you get the drum theme, like, and it like builds, but it's this kind of almost somber war theme that it works in with through Godzilla, but it just keeps this emotional undercurrent. But it's just funny that I think Yamazaki, he's a smart enough filmmaker as a mainstream filmmaker to understand that like it worked for Nolan, it will work for me. You know what I mean? Like too many filmmakers, I think nowadays
seeing
they get precious about being like, well, this is a great film, and I'm going to do what the great film did because it worked. And it's not a matter of being derivative, because it's actually not, because he's specific enough in the setting, the character, the theme, and all that. So when he's doing like a moment that is borrowed from another film, it pays off really well because he's using a formula that's worked before, but it's not like a hollow formula. It's not like he's shortcutting something. He's just borrowing something from another movie that works at that moment. And you get many moments in this movie where you're just like, it's either touching or exciting. It's just, you're like, you sit back, you're like, that didn't surprise me. I knew it was coming, but I'm happy it worked that way because it satisfies my expectations and it fulfills the things I want out of this movie. That's
interesting, the idea of like the lack of borrowing from other films in terms of close chronological proximity. Because I was rewatching Two Towers and Return of the King, and I was like, in with the distance we have now, it's so obvious that Jackson is borrowing from in terms of his combat sequences from Gladiator, which then it borrows from Saving Private Ryan. And you're like, when you see those films in the space of 5 years, right, 98 to 2003, you're like, okay, this is a thing where people are seeing what works really well in another movie that just came out, and then they're going to be like, well, we're going to do it like that, right? We're going to have sort of shaky camera work in the combat sequences to convey this. And you're like, that was a good point with sort of like why not borrow from someone like Nolan, who's someone working at the apex. You're like, if you want to do sort of another blockbuster movie, why aren't we doing this? Like that's just a smart strategy, right? Like,
And frankly, I don't know. I think I've seen other guys online make this comment, but there's few things in a movie that's like as satisfying as like normal dudes being like, "We're bringing our boats to do the work." Like,
Yeah.
the heroes
Yeah,
coming
yeah.
in their boats. You're like, yes, yes. I want to stand up and be like, the guys are bringing their
yeah,
boats.
share the screen.
Real beautiful boaters.
Yes,
Okay, so Nolan as a bridge to another topic. This movie, comparing it to Batman Begins, perhaps explains why, while I really like this movie, I don't have this immense enthusiasm. And I just want to sort of explain what I mean by this. So I feel like for people who are really into kaiju movies or, Godzilla movies, and there's way more Godzilla movies than I follow. But my sense reading some reviews online from just regular people is that this movie is kind of like when I watched Batman Begins. So someone really into Batman where you're like, finally, like someone's making like a Godzilla movie that's like, it's treating the material seriously, but it understands Godzilla and it's just delivering on all those fronts. And that was sort of my experience with Batman Begins, where you're like, with someone treating the material seriously, you're almost surprised, right? I can imagine someone who's like huge into Godzilla watching this movie, almost being surprised by how good, say, the character scenes are. You're like, what? Like this isn't the Godzilla movie. Like these sequences we're getting earlier in the Japan, but because I'm not like I don't understand that tradition that well. That like I feel like, well, I quite like this movie, enjoyed it quite a bit. I feel like there's an enthusiasm gap I have that I just see out there by certain people who are very passionate about this subject matter. And so it's the sort of thing where you're like, I think there's a segment of people out there who, if you adore like the old Godzilla, and if you've been hoping for like sort of a movie that delivers on this front, I feel like this one seems to be doing that for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that there's been between this and Shin Godzilla about 5 or 6 years ago. That's a couple of good Godzilla movies that have come out of Japan recently that are more than just what people who grew up watching the old series,
guys in suits slugging each other.
That are actually really like just good movies, good dramas. And the thing I would say about this movie is, despite Anton, I think you're right that there's an enthusiasm that people who are big Godzilla people that I know really liked this movie a lot. But also I want to encourage people who might be like, I don't like Godzilla. That's silly. I don't like that. You should check this movie out, because do you like good action movies? Do you like movies that have a heart and tell a compelling human drama? Then you should watch this movie. Do you like World War II era like action?
No,
movies?
like I actually
would recommend this to our dad. Because he loves those kind of like, that era of like war movies and but also like some drama and so I just want to suggest that people who might not be into Godzilla should check this out.
Yeah, like I think even if I convinced my wife to just sit down and watch this, she would have come away and been like, "Oh, like that was pretty good." But what then? I think you mentioned this sort of in your review, Aaron. But then the other side of it is that, and I think this is why the movie feels a little bit like Spielberg. We've mentioned, so it's treating the material seriously, but it's not going in that right. Like I think Aaron, you were sort of like the elevated horror dimension, where it's like, where you're trying to treat it so artistically that it doesn't actually provide satisfaction within the sort of conventions of the genre and the tradition. So that's actually one of the accomplishments of this film, is that it delivers in multiple ways. And for people who are enthusiastic about
it's not a slog, it's still a fun movie.
It's not like they're like, we're doing a Godzilla as like an ultra serious post-war drama
and the family aspect. But I'm like, it's also just a really entertaining movie. Like it doesn't take itself. It's not self-serious, even though it treats Godzilla seriously.
That's a good way to put it.
But I also want to, like, before we wrap up this conversation about Godzilla Minus One, I do want to point out that the movie does something refreshing, and I point out this in the review. it treats Godzilla as like an absolute evil monster. There's not a moment in this movie that it's like Godzilla's a hero or something misunderstood.
the
or
misunderstood monster.
Yeah,
If only
it's
we
like,
hadn't.
no, he's evil. He's an avatar of evil. His eyes are demonic eyes. The way that they make his eyes in this movie are actually really creepy. And anytime he shows up, it's just like pure rage. And it doesn't need to be
I really like the
explained.
Godzilla design.
So
in this
what do you
movie, by
make
the way.
of what do you make of that? Like, is there any sort of deeper meaning to that? Like, is it just the sort of the him being a symbol of kind of all that's horrible about war? Is it that war also reflects sort of this primordial aspect within?
I mean,
sort of the human.
Frankly, the way his eyes look reminds me of on like when you go into like a temple in Japan, there's like
Oni, the demons. Yeah.
the demons
Oh,
that
yeah,
guard
yeah.
the gate.
They have that like, yeah, they have that like sort of like angry, like,
and they don't
kind of, like,
blink.
eye
It's
on-
like the
on
idea
the
that their
mouth.
eyes are on you at all times.
Yeah,
You
the
can't-
brow.
You cannot hide. If you pass through the gate, they will see you, right?
Yeah.
And it's this idea that he's this like all-watching avatar of death, and like you will not escape him. He has eyes on you, and he's gonna get you. And I think there's something there in the design, honestly, that it's drawn on classical Japanese things, but it's also just the way that they've decided to design him. Is that he is much less kind of like terrestrial in this. He's not huge, but he actually seems like supernatural almost, like the way he acts.
I
When they
think you're
first
right.
encounter
Like,
him
it
on the
doesn't.
island, though, he's a bit more like a T-Rex.
He is, but
And then when he mutates, he's
he mutates because the nuclear bomb
Yeah.
detonates at Bikini Atoll and like supercharges
But
him.
then the bomb almost makes him right. Like, he becomes then more of like sort of a supernatural demon than
Yes.
then a sort of believable like prehistoric creature
Right,
that's
exactly.
been like
Yeah,
reawoken,
totally.
right?
Because one of the things that the old Godzilla,
But it combines it
by-
within the story,
yeah.
those two ideas.
by the-
Yes.
sometimes the designs of newer Godzillas do make him too lizard-like or like dinosaur.
Yes,
right?
and in the American
in the-
1998,
yeah,
that's
he's
the
totally a
epitome of it,
T-Rex
where it's just
from-
purely kind
yeah.
of
a giant
Jurassic Park.
T-Rex from Jurassic Park. But if he had a Habsburg jaw, but the
The royal jaw.
because he
We'll circle back to 1998.
But the thing about that this design does really well is it also brings in a little bit of like the look of him in a man in a suit, where he almost has
Yep,
like
I totally saw that too.
the pectoral muscles, and like he's like but little arms, right? Like he's
Yep.
like, but they've managed somehow to make him scary and compelling as a creature design without looking silly, still paying homage to the original. He looks like Godzilla. You're like, oh, that's the same monster from the old 54
Yep.
film.
I think one of the really smart things is having the fact that when he charges up his atomic breath, each slot of his spine moves out as like a different like cog. It's really
Those are
creepy,
cool.
and so it shows again like a visual representation of the charge of his power. But then it also is almost like he's like turning into some kind of like mountain or something, right? Like it's like something like like truly like
Crystals and like
beyond like animal. It's like
Elemental.
primordial, elemental, yes. And he's just building up, and he's going to unleash this.
And then it serves a useful purpose within the storytelling of an action sequence where you anticipate that the giant explosion is coming, because you can start to see him
charging up.
Yeah, him charging up slowly, right? Like, so it creates this suspense in the sequence.
Also, just like the way he lumbers around is, I couldn't help but think of like Ray Harryhausen Titans in old like stop motion. The way that like the conceptions of like Greek Titans within storytelling, right, is these almost giant avatars that are unmovable.
But it also gives the impression of a aquatic animal moving out to land.
Yeah,
Right.
he's very awkward on land, and it's kind of like I don't know.
Like a penguin.
I'm happy that he's not like more seamless, but it is like a little awkward. But it's one of those things you're like, yeah, he's still Godzilla. He's still like a little funny with the short arms. No, it's a good movie. It's honestly like a surprisingly good movie. As my friend Jay Luke mentioned, he's like, I never thought I wouldn't go this far, but like his comment was like, I never thought like a Godzilla movie would make me want to cry. You're like, this is
but there are moments that I
that.
almost did. Yeah, it's like
No, it's a very
it
touching
tugs the
movie.
heartstrings.
Yeah, and it and which is a proof of the fact that it hits its storytelling beats very well. So I'm not really surprised that it's this kind of remarkable foreign language hit, at the box office. People don't ever talk about this, but like foreign films don't really make money in North America. And the most recent one that people really talked about was Parasite. Parasite made like 50 something million, which was
Yep.
it's a pretty big deal. And then it won Best
So
Picture. So
what's this at?
this is past 50 million. This is
Really?
the highest grossing Godzilla movie from the Japanese ones. It's like the highest grossing foreign language film since Parasite. And if you go back, those two are the highest since like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So it's like
Oh wow,
a remarkably
quite a
high
hit, yeah.
grossing movie. The other one, and this is not part of the conversation, but the other movie that's made a significant amount of money in North America that nobody's talking about is Boy and the Heron, which is far and away
Yeah.
the highest grossing Ghibli film.
When I went to see it at the theater here in Waterloo at the Princess Cinema before Christmas, that first week there were lines down the block. It was sold out every night.
Yeah, like well, it's the I think people underestimate how much a average viewer will be like, I'm curious. I've heard this Godzilla movie's good. I'll actually watch it, and the foreign language is not a barrier. Or like with Ghibli, it's like Hayao Miyazaki's actually a household name.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then
streaming
they have
has
the dub.
only helped that. Streaming has only helped
Yeah, with
because
Netflix
the
having it
prevalence
all.
on Netflix and
Yeah.
then on.
Well,
Yep.
fun fact about Boy and the Heron is that the reason that they licensed out to Netflix is that that's what paid for the Boy and the Heron. Because Toshio Suzuki was like, we can't afford this movie. It's going to take way longer because of COVID and price and costs and stuff. And he convinced Miyazaki to put it on streaming. Miyazaki did not comprehend what the concept of streaming was. He didn't know what it is. But Suzuki's like, it's like, we should do this. It will expand like our audience, but also will make us a lot of good residual money. And so that's the fact that you can watch Porco Rosso on Netflix is why The Boy and the Heron was made. They paid for it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
On top of that, I think that the fact that Ghibli has though a dub and with big Hollywood stars does also increase the access. So like children and people who might normally not watch subtitles will go.
Yeah, the G Kids does a very good job of doing their North American English language releases.
When I saw Boy and the Heron, it was in the dub because I went with the couple families with kids, all of us. So
isn't it Robert?
You'll
Pattinson
enjoy
as the
Robert
Heron?
Pattinson as the Heron. Yeah,
I saw the Japanese in theaters. So, anyways, there's a lot of good Japanese movies out, but Godzilla Minus One, even if you're skeptical about Godzilla movies, I truly do think you will enjoy this movie as just like a rock solid blockbuster.
When I found you in the wreckage of that ship, I considered leaving you. I was afraid you could bring trouble to us. What do you think they want?
Godzilla Minus One is kind of an interesting counterpoint because it is an example of tried and true forms of blockbuster storytelling, right? It is classical-ish. It's a classical story because it's Godzilla. It's going back to like classic stuff there, but it's also taking cues from things like Jaws and like more established classics within the genre to get across the story. And it's a theatrical success, right? It's comparing it to Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, A Child of Fire Part 1, which is a hilariously long title, as Anton pointed out in his review.
Is it Child of Fire Part 1, not Part 1?
No, it's Part
Child
1.
Of Fire?
Oh, Part 1, Child of Fire.
You got to think of it as
Part 2 is going to be this whatever one in April, May.
It doesn't matter. It's Rebel Moon 1 and 2. But
yeah.
I feel like the fact that I messed it up is kind of proof of the fact that it's unwieldy. But regardless, it is a perfect example of the emergent form of the blockbuster, right? It is a big director, big Hollywood director, big cast, big budget. They shelled out like $200 million for it.
for both.
Yeah, for both. But he filmed them back to as one movie, right?
Yep.
It's like a 4-hour movie, and he filmed them both.
But that's still
it's a big budget. It's their most It's one of their most expensive movies. I think it might be Netflix's individual. No, I think Red Notice is still their most expensive, but one of their most. Red Notice is that movie that doesn't exist with Dwayne Johnson and Gal Gadot that nobody watched.
No, I'm just joking. I heard of it, never watched it.
but it's a movie that like there's no real determiner of whether it's successful or not, right? There's no box office.
Mhm.
And so all we're left with is the movie. And the movie itself is kind of baffling. We're all honestly like we're all big Zack Snyder fans,
Yeah.
especially
Yes, we did a
compared to
retrospective.
in 29.
I even like
I'm
a
a
lot of
defender of
movies.
Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice.
Yeah.
Come on.
Me and Anders think Batman Superman is like the best superhero movie since Nolan concluded his trilogy. Anton is a big fan of Dawn of the Dead remake.
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah, I'm rethinking my like I liked Sucker Punch, and I'm probably if I rewatch it again, I might even like it even more.
I actually think Rebel Moon has some interesting similarities to Sucker Punch for the same reasons that I wrote in my review that I don't really like it.
Yeah, but Rebel Moon is him. So the story's pretty familiar if you follow anything about movie news. He pitched this as a Star Wars movie. It's essentially, and he also back in like 2007, 2008 pitched this samurai version of like an anime version of Seven
Sci-fi.
Samurai. And
Seven Samurai.
this is Seven Samurai and Star Wars, and he's smashing them together into his own space opera, and he wants to create a franchise on Netflix. The fact of the matter is, though, is that the movie is as derivative as it sounds. It's like it is. Let's just take the components of A New Hope. It's the exact same plot, and Seven Samurai, and we're just like, there's no elements that are new. It's just imagine if like Luke and Han and an Obi-Wan character have to go and get some other fighters to help protect a village who need to give money to some like
Yeah, you're
evil
right.
people.
Like Charlie Hunnam is.
Yeah,
Solo Han
they
Solo.
got to defend like the Lars farm, you know.
Yeah, and I'm not like opposed to derivative stuff. I really am not. We just talked about how a Godzilla movie is awesome because it borrows from Jaws and it borrows from the old Godzilla stuff and it borrows from all these other elements. But this movie, I watched it last night and I don't really remember anything about it except for the fact that like most of the movie's out of focus.
Please, Zach, stop being your own.
Yeah, stop being your own DP. Go back and get the dude. I forget his name. I'll look it up in a moment. I'll correct. But like the guy who did Watchmen and stuff, like he's a really good DP. He's a really good DP. Just go work with him again, because people who drag on the slow mo speed ramp stuff. That's the good stuff in this. The action of her like pulling out gun and blowing guys' heads off, Sophia Batala, like her being like this badass secret warrior kind of Jedi figure.
Yeah, the scene in the barn is
cool.
Pretty good action scene.
It's cool, but the plot of the movie is like, it reminded me more of Jupiter Ascending than it did of even the non-Star Wars movies that I like John Carter and Valerian, which those are movies that I'm like, these are sweet. They're not Star Wars, but these are
those movies
fun,
have imagination.
Imaginative films.
So
Anders,
so
my
from
review's
Anders
out there, right? Like, so I didn't like the movie, but I feel like I'm, mildly warm on aspects of it. Anders,
I want to be. I
We
want
like
to
Zack.
tweet
We
the
love
other
Zack.
day
I
was
want to
pretty
like some
harsh.
things, but I just did not really like this movie at all. Because I think, as you say, Aaron, like if you've told me on paper someone's like do a Star Wars Seven Samurai mashup,
It sounds
and
awesome.
beats were relatively the same, I'm like, I'm down. I could totally imagine that. But this is like if someone who didn't really understand what made those movies good just picked the elements and put them together, or they understood certain things about it, and so Zack Snyder does, and this is the same thing with Sucker Punch. He gets the appeal of these fan culture properties and things like that, but he kind of thinks that he can like put them together in a coherent way that doesn't really work. It's like there was moments in this film the same way as like Sucker Punch where I'm like, wait a minute, and I'm not talking about being a plausible here, like trying to say that there's like plot holes or things like that. No, it's more like it just literally doesn't make sense. So like a scene here, I'll pick one scene. There's a scene in this movie where a character, there's a scene in this movie where a character has to tame and ride a flying beast, right? And we've seen scenes like this in other movies. Most recently, the one that I'll have to compare it against is in Avatar. Both Avatar and Way of Water, because Way of Water repeats it because it has
It's so interesting
Torch
in
do it,
Way of
right?
Water.
But in those movies, like it makes sense. Like even if it's cliched that he's gonna like learn to tame this beast, here we have this character, was it Tarek or whatever his name is, who's like,
Tarek.
I'm not really clear
Bryce
why he
Desner.
has this connection with the beast, right? This it's
It's
like kind of like
because
a bird
he's
cat
not
thing.
white. That's why. Like that's almost it's the
It just
implicit.
now it's like, ooh, I don't know, man. But like, so he does the thing like from Jurassic World where he like holds out his hand, and then somehow like the animal sort of like understands it's not going to attack him. Okay, then he jumps on the beast, but then for some reason it's trying to get him off and like smashing him against rocks. I'm like, why is if it already sort of had this mental connection with him, why is it doing that? None of it makes any
No,
sense. And then he does all this like flying
but
around stuff, and like
but the
it
best part is
honestly
that it turns out that that entire sequence was
is
about
irrelevant.
no,
No,
it wasn't
goading.
irrelevant. The payoff is that it was like a fake out.
Yeah, that
And
he'll
then
eat the
bad
guy.
owner jumps on it and then he kills him.
Yeah.
It's like good. I was hoping that would happen.
It
So
happened,
the whole
but
thing was actually kind of just like a bad joke.
pointless. Pointless. It's just like it's like so but there's moments where like he understands like the kind of beats and expectations of how you would do that scene, but in the context of all the things we've just said, it doesn't really work at all. Like, and on top of that, it looks kind of terrible.
Oh,
So like
moments look sweet.
there's lots of moments like that
Yeah.
in the movie that are they could be kind of cool. And you know, funny enough, Anton, based on your review, the one part that I actually thought, if you wanted to know, I'll be generous. The one thing that I actually thought was enjoyable in that sort of goofy way that I like things in certain other films, like even Fifth Element or Valerian, speaking of like Euro fantasy and stuff like that, is the Space Mennonites crystal.
Yeah, they're great.
They're just too funny. Like it's like this is totally Zack Snyder. They're like buff dudes who are like into like having like you know, sexual like freedom and things like that. But like we were also good, hardworking like farm guys. It's just like so bizarre. But I found them kind of funny. But like even the way like when the villain comes to their village for the first time, it's like everything's so like mechanical and like how they like transition from moment to moment is I couldn't take the film seriously, but not in a like that I wanted to. Like I can have fun with a really like goofy movie, but it ended up being like you, Aaron, I kind of like just tuned out what was even happening at certain points. I'm like, again, like when they meet the one character who then they fight the General Spider character and stuff like that. I didn't understand the character motivations
What
of
is
any
with
of
the
these
spider?
people. Like, why are they doing it? And why do they suddenly in the end then decide like it just there's like either it's like a throwaway line or like things change. Like it just they go through these beats because they have to, not because it like comes together in any kind of way. So like
it
I found the
shows
film really like a slog to watch, honestly.
I think it really shows. Like I think it's the final proof that like you know we in 2021 we did our Zack Snyder retrospective and we probably all far more admirers of him than most people. But
Totally.
like it's very clear now if you look at the ones his weakest films, it's like Zack Snyder's best when he's using someone else's like properties, stories, conventions, and then doing his own sort of version with that, rather than him trying to just sort of create a sort of general story within sort of general patterns of fandom and geekdom.
Yeah, like this is the very argument why I like Batman, Superman more than I like Watchmen. And Watchmen's one of my favorite of his, but I actually think that when you have the actual heroes that he is now playing with and using his stylistic things to comment upon, it actually like registers better because it's like he's just going straight to the source and now he's playing with the actual toys that like Moore was playing with. Like you know,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. That's why
just
I said in my
commenting on
review
sideways.
that like Alan Moore wanted originally to actually use the Charlton comic
Yeah.
characters, right? But they said no, don't do it because we might use them in other things. So like Night Owl was supposed to be Blue Beetle originally. Like,
Yeah. And probably also then he, I think Zack Snyder probably also needs like a solid screenwriter.
yeah.
There's a few other people on the credits for this, but I know he's involved. But
We need
he
Chris
doesn't.
Terrio.
Well, Terrio and him have a good they have a good
Oscar-winning
chemistry.
Chris Terrio.
They work well together. Like you
Rise
need
of Skywalker's Chris Terrio.
Yeah. you need like so it's just
Still like it.
It's kind of it's a wild movie. I just don't really understand.
Yeah, here's the
going on.
thing.
It's a shame because I was kind of excited for it when I heard about it.
I was too.
Yeah, when I was
kind
like
of
a
a shame.
Zack Snyder space opera
opera.
on Netflix, sounds good.
Yeah.
But so much of this movie is like really perfunctory too, and I was really disappointed in the climax because I knew it was half a movie, but the climax is just so lame. It's just like
Yeah.
Charlie Hunnam decides I'm actually a bad guy. And then you're like, I'm supposed to be like shocked. And then you have Ray Fisher, who I think is great in Justice League. Like he's
Yeah.
really good as Cyborg.
Yeah, in the
But
Snyder
here-
Cut of Justice League, it's like this like we discovered this like performance that was latent in the footage, and then
Yeah.
here it's just
But here it's just like when
statuesque. Like
when
it's just
no, but it's like when the rebel characters show up, I was like, I just started laughing because I was like, wait, you actually designed like these are the rebels against the Imperium. And of course, the Imperium have to look like a bunch of Nazis. Like it's
Of
just
course.
at this point, it was. I think last night when I was watching this movie, right early on when the Ed Screen and his folks just first showed up on the planet, I texted being like, I appreciate that Dune leaned into the fact with the designs to be like, we'll have the good guys have these military outfits and stuff, and like we're not gonna lean into like old conventions. We're just gonna, they're a very military society, they're aristocratic, they're gonna dress like aristocratic military society. Like, and the treaties are the ones who dress more like the Imperials in Star Wars than the Harkonnens do, right? The Harkonnens dress otherwise. But in this movie, he shows up, it's like, oh, of course the bad guys have to be some form of space fascist. And then it goes one step further where it's like, okay, what does freedom look like to you? I know, it's a bunch of guys in dreads. It's just like, it's
well, it reminded me of, it's like he tried to do like his version of the Matrix Zion.
yeah. No, but it's so late, and it's the first time in a while where I watched a movie and I was like, can we please have some interesting sci-fi design in a movie that's not derivative? And like, I don't care if the story is derivative, I don't care if it's inspired by other things and it's playing off of other elements of films, that's everything. But just give me a design that is not like either like it's trying to be a spaceship that's trying to be the Millennium Falcon, or a mystical character that's trying to be a Jedi. Like, just can I get something that is different? And I think this might have registered extra because currently I'm reading Dan Simmons' Hyperion, which is a very good sci-fi novel from like 1990, Hugo winning novel. It's kind of like Canterbury Tales in Space, and it's a novel that like has truly outlandish descriptions of the world and the character, but it's so interesting, characters and stuff in it, that it's so interesting that I was just like, I think cinema kind of stalled on its way of portraying sci-fi, and it hasn't like actually tapped into all the stuff that's there in the literature in terms of its imaginative potential. And it's why I give
Is it doing anything since like the 80s?
No,
Has there
but
been
that's
any
why I think
original-
I will give a pass to stuff like Valerian. Like Valerian is very visually like surprising and interesting, and it's
But
doing
that's
stuff-
because Valerian is also based on a pre-existing comic that was written in the
Mobius and
60s
stuff,
and
right?
70s, right? Yeah.
But
There's a whole series in France.
But this is also one of the main reasons why Avatar is so good.
Yeah.
Is like it pays so much attention to the visual element of the storytelling, where it's like, what is the thing that is going to convey the most important aspects of a sci-fi world, is that visceral element that the audience takes out of it. So it's like, it has to look not just credible, it has to look mind-blowing, or else people aren't going to like actually take it in. And the more distance we get from 2009, the more I feel like Pandora is this actually, people complained about it as like it's derivative. It's like, it's the rainforest combined with Ferngully combined with this. And it's like, no, Pandora is one of the great sci-fi creations because it seems real. It seems fully fleshed out, like a genuine, real sci-fi world that's credible when you look at it. And that's something that I'm begging for certain of these sci-fi movies. It's partially why I love Dune so much, because its depiction of Arrakis is like so incredibly detailed. And it's strange. It's, Villeneuve leaned into the fact
Dune was very strange.
that Frank Herbert's depiction of a sci-fi world is like bizarre. And he doesn't go into a David Lynch style of being like, I'm going to play up the disgusting or like absurd bastardizations of this material.
Yeah, it's not grotesque.
But it is strange, defamiliar. It is a truly alien world without aliens in it. Rebel Moon is none of that. Rebel Moon is familiar. Rebel Moon's safe. There's aspects of it that's enjoyable. I don't even dislike the performances. Like, I like Charlie Hunnam. I like
They're kind of
these
funny.
actors.
I got a
I like
kick out of the fact that there's like at least 3 actors from Game of Thrones, 2 of which both played Dario Naharis.
Yeah, it's Scrand and Michael
And then
Huisman.
Sazner is also yeah.
And you
Also
know,
in Game of
Anton,
Thrones, but-
your hilarious comment in your review where it's like they did the happy coincidence of finding Simon Hansu from Gladiator on a Gladiator world. It's
But they're doing not much else
But
with him in
Jimon
this one.
Hansu,
But Simon Hansu's awesome. He's a cool actor. I want more of him.
Hopefully in
he
part
deserves
2,
more.
Yeah.
I just recently watched Gran Turismo. He gets to play father
Oh,
of the
he's in
character.
that? Oh,
He's the dad.
oh.
Yeah, the dad whose dream of being who was a like semi-pro soccer player, and he wants his son to play soccer, play a real sport.
Is he in Gladiator too?
Oh, I don't know. But
Because
I don't know. He might be.
Most
I
anticipated.
need to-
I know it's the boy.
I'm
the
very
boy,
pumped.
Right?
I'm very pumped. Yeah.
Paul Mescal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But they're not doing the completely insane Nick Cage
No.
script.
Yeah.
Wait. I didn't even realize. Is this true that Denzel's in Gladiator 2?
Yeah.
Apparently.
That's absurd. What? I didn't even know that until right now.
And Pedro Pascal too.
Yeah, Pedro Pascal. Derek Jacobi again is back as the Senator.
Yeah, and
Gracchus.
Connie Nielsen returning as the mother. Yeah,
How old is Derek Jacobi?
He's pretty old.
pretty old.
Oh man, yeah. Derek Jacobi is 85. I always think of
I love Derek
how
Jacobi.
much I love the opening of Henry V of him as the chorus, and then he opens up the studio onto the battlefield.
Kindly to judge our play.
Man, so maybe everybody should just take a break from sci-fi and just start making Shakespeare adaptations again, but like big budget ones.
What about a sci-fi Shakespeare adaptation?
Yeah. What if we had some kind of tentacle fetish and like threats of man on man rape, and we could work that in, and it's like the Snyder version of like
The number of line that
Snyder
there's that
version
one
of
line in
Hamlet.
this movie. Oh.
The cantina scene. I was almost appalled because it's almost shot for shot. Like
It was
the
getting there's
construction of it is
aspects
absurd.
there's aspects of Rebel Moon which remind me of like the worst aspects of the like the Star Trek movies. Like anytime like which like I love a lot of the Star Trek
Search for
movies, but when
Spock, where he goes to.
Oh, Mutara restricted.
Exactly, when those movies are trying to slip into trying to be Star Wars and they got like really lame and they had their own version of the space cantina and you're just like, oh guys. Plus
And what we also really need is Uhura doing a fan dance. Is what we really need.
No, that's the good stuff.
I need to revisit Final Frontier.
I don't think Final Frontier is like nearly as bad as people say, but it's not
like
good.
when
I remember I have a lot of fond memories of watching it. You know, I still whenever I go camping.
What does
have to-
God need with a starship?
But when you in
Anyway.
Rebel Moon does like to demonstrate also like the movie's sort of lack of coherence and lack of a sense of like the overall world, like when they arrive at the planet and then there's sort of the alien spider played by Jenna Malone who's kidnapping children.
Yeah.
I actually was like, wait a second, there are aliens in this universe.
yeah.
Like I didn't realize up until that point that there were aliens, and you're like, it has a weird inconsistency of like, so is
Yeah,
this like a
exactly,
Star Wars
totally.
world where there's a lot of aliens and there's a lot of people, or is this like a Dune future where it's just like humans like spread out over the galaxy?
But humans have gotten really weird. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know.
Or the one great success in the movie is Anthony Hopkins is the weird like night robot who for some reason is thinking back to a king from like centuries past that he served, and then has the moment in the river where he's just like kind of like thinking about like his flowers on his head, and you're like, what is this?
I did enjoy that actually, because I really like movies that have Anthony Hopkins as a robot in them. But okay, let me transition for 1 second here. Just thinking about like the possibilities of Netflix money. By no means am I saying that the movie I'm about to mention is a good movie, but it speaks to the director's like interests and ability to deliver, which is Six Underground by Michael Bay has great action scenes. It is a completely derivative Ryan Reynolds vehicle, but it also has some imagination. I mean, those cool like magnet things and stuff like
Oh
that.
no, it's
But
great
like,
magazine.
so like, it's a movie that like it's all the it's strong in a lot of the ways that I think Rebel Moon's not. Even though like most people would be like, this is like
Derivative. Yeah.
derivative and also like just kind of trashy, but like Michael Bay was able to bring his strengths to that in a way for some reason that Snyder, I don't know, I don't know if it's even overreaching. I just can't
I
really
don't
get
think
a
it
feel
is.
for it. Like I actually think Army of the Dead was better than this.
I think Snyder could do a space opera. I honestly think.
Yeah.
He's proven it in parts of like Justice League, especially, I think.
Yeah.
And I think I was the most positive on Army of the Dead of the three of us because I liked the mythos. That's the other aspect is that this movie spends a lot of time
Zombie
trying to
King
build
or
up.
whatever.
It tries to build up a backstory that is like mythic about this imperial training and her like her whole like tragic past and stuff. And Anders, you made a comment about like Riddick, and it made me wish for the like coolness of the necromongers in Riddick, where it honestly did.
I hate to say it, but like, wow, my sarcastic Netflix or a Letterboxd review of Rebel Moon was, I take back all the bad things I said about the Chronicles.
You should, because the Riddick trilogy is good, and I'm excited for Furia, the fourth one. It's gonna be sweet. I love Vin Diesel in the Fast and Furious movies, but the Riddick ones are his best, like blockbuster role. And the Riddick movies are actually they're actually a good comp for this, because the Riddick movies are films that understand genre really well and play to it, because Pitch Black plays as a like prison escape it's like a Flight of the Phoenix type thing, but mixed prison movie. Chronicles of Riddick is the insane space opera, but it actually creates a comprehensive and engrossing mythos for what this universe is, even if it's absurd in like moment to moment.
To the point that they were able to make a spin-off video game, Escape from Butcher Bay, which was a great video game.
It was a very good video game. And then Riddick, the third one, is like a Western. It's like a good bounty hunter, like Western movie. And the first 30 minutes of the movie is like essentially silent of just like Riddick trying to survive in this world. It's just that's a thing of Snyder is without a doubt a more talented like visual stylist than David Twohy. There's no question about it. And I think actually his cast is better than those movies too, but it's just Snyder seems almost like too enamored of the intended emotional effect of his filmmaking that he's jumping steps to be like, well, somebody's gonna think this is this and it's so badass, or they're gonna be like, this is such an like amazing moving moment. And it's like, dude, you gotta like actually construct the stuff underneath it, a foundation of story that like can earn that moment. You can't just like skip to it. And that's my thing with Rebel Moon. Despite a movie that I thought was way too long for what it is, it seemed to like kind of just skip to the next part, and it's like we're just gonna do the next space opera scene to the next space opera scene and just keep going. I mean, I guess come
any last
April we'll be doing
defenses or like, do you think that part two could actually recuperate things? I think that, to me, part two isn't going to have a major impact on how I view the first one, because my issues are not about like aspects of the story that will be filled in and things like that. It's more just the fundamental form and function of the film. As
you could tell a more coherent. It could be a more.
But I'll have to check it out. But yeah.
Well, I do love to gamble.
Here we go.
What's the bet?
If Tarek can break that creature out there, his debts are squared with me. But if you don't ride him, you all get a chain and a shackle. That's the deal.
Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Three Brothers Filmcast.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.